Hi. Okay, so we are back. We are so excited to have Sarah Rodriguez here to teach our first workshop. Sarah Rodriguez is a graduate research assistant for the Center for Public History at the University of West Georgia. She has been conducting, transcribing, and processing oral history since 2016. She holds a BA in history from William and Mary and is currently completing her MA in public history at the University of West Georgia. Thank you so much, Sarah, for being here with us today, and we look forward to your presentation. So thank you so much, Sarah. I'm gonna just throw it over to you. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be with y'all today. Let me go ahead and see if I can figure out how to share my screen. Okay. Does everyone see it? Can I get an audio? Yes.
Yes.
Fantastic. All right. So thank you for that awesome introduction, Emily. Once again, my name is Sarah I. Rodriguez. I work for the University of West Georgia's Center for Public History, and I'm going to be taking you through a bit of an introduction into conducting an interview for an oral history project. Now, first off, a little bit more about me. I'm originally from a small town called Natchez, Mississippi, but right now I'm at the University of West Georgia, working on my master's in history. I'm concentrating in public history, and I'm working as a graduate research assistant for the Center for Public History, as was mentioned. But previously, I was at William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, getting my bachelor's in history and a minor in economics, though the economics is mostly for cocktail party conversation. I do mostly work in history. When I was there, I worked as a student oral historian for an LGBTQ plus history project. But beyond that, I've also done work in university residence life as an RA. I've worked at a variety of museums, historic houses. I've worked at an archaeological site, done some work in tourism, and specifically food tourism, which is as fun as it sounds. But as you can see from my introduction of myself, I did kind of jump around. I didn't really give you a chronological layout of my life. That's kind of how oral histories work. Sometimes when you're asking folks questions, even if you do it in an ordered way, they might talk about it in what is a most natural way for them. So getting started, how do you prepare for an interview before you even get into the room? Well, something to keep in mind is that an oral history is kind of a combination between a formal research project or interview and an informal conversation. And as you'll see from what I'm talking about, there's a lot of push and pull between those two, depending on the type of person you're talking to. So first off, I would recommend making sure you do your research beforehand so that you can get a better idea of whatever historical period you're talking to this person about, or maybe a little bit more about this person's life so that you can ask relevant questions. Also, I would recommend listening to and watching other oral histories. There's a lot of great content out there on the internet, YouTube. A lot of oral history projects do put their archives online. So listen to those, watch those. It does give you a bit more of an idea of what the setup is, more familiarity with it, and teaches you some methods and techniques you may or may not want to use. Once you've done all that research, make sure you're writing down your questions and topics if they aren't already given to you. Once again, this isn't necessarily anything structured. The person you're talking to may not even answer all of the questions, but it does help you kind of keep the interview going in case a pause happens. And then I would say pretty importantly, I know y'all are doing a workshop later on the equipment you'll be using. Make sure you know your equipment. The last thing you want is for a mic failure or any of that dysfunction to interrupt the flow of the conversation. So make sure you test it all out beforehand. Make sure that you can hear everything, that there's no background noise, etc. And then mentally, I would prepare to pay attention. It could be a little tricky to listen to, say, your friend talk about something on and on and on that you might not be interested in without giving a pause, but this is a different kind of conversation. So prepare to pay attention. It matters to make the interviewer comfortable and so that you can keep track of what they're saying. All right, so you've done your preparation. Now you need to, once again, write down those questions. So what kind of questions do you want to ask? Start with an introduction. All this means is mention at the beginning of the tape who you are, who the person you're interviewing is, the date, the location, what project you're working with, and what organization you're working with as well. It just kind of helps keep it organized in case something gets mislabeled. And then I would try to ask open-ended questions, but don't be afraid to get specific. So for example, you're going to want to let the narrator, I mentioned this later, you're going to want to let the narrator or the interviewee kind of lead with what they want to talk about. So instead of asking very specifically, did you grow up in Coweta County? Yes, no. Did you attend high school here? Yes, no. Do you have any siblings? Yes, no. That can kind of create a very short conversation, and you can go through your questions quickly. Ask more open-ended questions like, what was it like growing up? What was your experience going to school here? That kind of thing. And then along with that, try to avoid leading questions. You want the narrator to take control of the story and for you to be, once again, this is their story, not yours. So you want to let them lead with whatever they have to say. Once again, let the narrator lead. If you're going to ask any controversial questions, and this would mostly be if once you've done research on the person, you notice there's some interesting things that that happened in their life that you might want to ask about. If it's controversial or could possibly make them a little uncomfortable, save it for later. Once they've gotten into the flow of it, they're much more likely to answer. And then finally, end your interview with a wrap-up question. This could be anything from asking them to reflect on their life if they're old enough, asking them if they want to mention anything that you hadn't asked about or you hadn't talked about already, or asking them why they wanted to participate in the project. All right, now, so you've done your research, you have your questions. How, once you get into the room, do you guide an interview? Well, once again, make sure you're letting the narrator lead. Once again, this is their story, not yours. And by letting someone else lead, by letting the narrator lead, they can kind of take you into some pretty interesting places that you might not have guessed ahead of time just by following your own questions. And you also don't have to go through in order through those questions. Sometimes the interviewee will jump around a little bit, which is totally fine. Make sure you have a pen or paper to take notes during the interview. This just kind of helps you keep track of any thoughts you might have, any follow-up questions you might want to ask, or any important timestamps you want to jot down. An example of this is in one oral history I did, the topic we were talking about was pretty emotional for the person I was talking to. So she needed a minute to compose herself. So she was silent for a little bit. So I did look at the recorder, mark down the time, say like 15 minutes. At 15 minutes, 20 seconds into the interview, the interviewee starts crying quietly. That way, so if you are only using an audio recording, whoever's listening to it later knows what's going on. And it does give more of that emotional context, which is one of the benefits of using oral histories. Then try to be patient and not interrupt. That's why taking notes for your follow-up questions can be helpful. You want to keep them in the flow of whatever they're talking about. At that same point, I would encourage you to keep to time. Now, if your supervisor has a specific time limit they set, or if there's a scheduling conflict that sets a time limit, great. Otherwise, I would encourage you to keep it to around an hour and a half. Beyond that, fatigue can start to set in, particularly for the interviewee who at that point has probably been talking straight for an hour or an hour and a half. I've made the mistake of letting an interview go 3 hours, mostly because the narrator had that amount of energy, but I did not. So make sure you keep to time. You can use one of those wrap-up questions if you're coming close to when you want to end. Photos and other objects, if the interviewee wants to bring them to the interview, can be very helpful in reminding them of different stories they want to tell. And by statements can be helpful. What I mean by that is, though you're going to be asking questions and you don't want to interrupt the person, perhaps they're the type of person that needs a bit of verbal feedback, just to show that you're listening to what they're saying. So if they're telling a particularly sad or difficult story, don't be afraid to say something like, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. That does sound difficult." It just kind of helps keep the flow going, depending on the type of person you're talking to. And then finally, practice makes perfect, or at least practice makes better. Though you can prepare as much as you want for conducting an oral history, I found that the best way to get better at it is to just do it. So if your first interview doesn't go exactly the way you want, don't feel bad, try again next time. It's part of the process. And then something else that's really important is building rapport with the interviewee. You might know the person you're talking to, which is great, but you might also be interviewing a complete stranger. So how do you get a complete stranger to open up to you and tell you all about their life? Well, a few tips that I have are to remind them that their story is important. That's one of the most common comments I get is when I'm talking to someone I'm doing an interview with, is them saying, "Oh, I don't know why you're asking me. Other folks' stories are more important." This might be the first time anyone has asked this person to go into their life in this much detail for this long. So remind them that their story is important. Each person's story is something only they can tell, and it creates a much more holistic view of that history and of the place of Coweta County. And then the research that you would have done ahead of time also is a way to show you care. Perhaps you saw, for example, that this person won some award at some point in their life. You find that in a newspaper. Asking them about that shows that you care about their story, you've done your research to prepare, and that you're invested in what they have to say. Once you get into the room to conduct this oral history, don't be afraid to chat beforehand to get to know each other a little bit better. You're about to ask this person to be really vulnerable with you for a long time. So it kind of helps them feel a little bit more comfortable if you're willing to open up a bit, talk a little bit about yourself to see if there's some commonalities. And then I would also say transparency is a huge part of that relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee. Make sure that from the beginning you tell them, without them asking, what the project's purpose is. Mention to them that the notes you're taking are just for your purposes only. It's not like it's going anywhere or you're judging them. It's just to keep track of the interview. Make sure you tell them what will happen to their oral history afterwards, and that they are in control of this story. They can stop the recording, pause the recording, if they want to, maybe not answer a question if they don't want to, or they can redact their interview anytime afterwards. I know y'all are getting some consent forms that they're going to be signing, so make sure you talk to folks at the Historical Society or your supervisor to get information on what is it, the whole process of what's going to happen, because that transparency can build a lot of trust. And then also, it's important to understand that differences do exist between the person you're talking to and you. Not only is this differences in opinion, which sometimes during an interview, if the person you're talking to says something a little bit shocking, try to control yourself as best you can. This is their story. They get to tell it the way they want to. That's the magic of oral history. So sometimes we as interviewers kind of have to sit silent a little bit. But at the same time, when I say understanding differences, I also encourage you to remember that people differ on the basis of race, gender, sexual orientation, age, socioeconomic background, and even a difference between you as a researcher and them as a interviewee. These all can create some power imbalances. Um, and that can all of that will always influence how an oral history comes across. Um, so just keep that in mind. No reason to get upset about it or try to fix it. The best thing to do is to understand that those exist and to be aware of them. Getting to know them, opening up to them, and being transparent with them can help with that. And then sometimes it is really about matching up the right two folks to talk. Once again, not your fault, just the way it works. And then finally, active listening. Hopefully this goes without saying, keep eye contact as much as you can, nod occasionally to show you're paying attention. It makes them more comfortable, and it also helps you stay on track on what to follow up on. So I put here a couple of resources if you want to learn a bit more further from what I've talked about. The Oral History Association's website has a lot of really great material. They have principles, best practices, instructions on different types of oral histories, blogs, and other things that are very helpful. I use that for this presentation. And then also Donald A. Ritchie wrote a book called Doing Oral History, a Practical Guide. If you want to get a copy of one of those, that's also pretty helpful. And then finally, here's my email. In case you want to follow up any questions that I didn't address or you don't get to ask, I'm happy to help out. I think this is a really cool project, and I think it's awesome that y'all are interested in helping out with this, because this is incredibly important work. So feel free to reach out should you need to. And I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And hopefully I've left time for some questions. Feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute yourself and I can try to help answer.
Thank you, Sarah, for that. That was fantastic. A fantastic overview of how to give interviews. I know that's a lot of information, but really she's covered a lot of important things to consider. If you do have any questions, please put those in the Q&A or in the chat. We do have some time to go over any questions. Some questions that did come up. Sarah, can you talk about, a lot of people might be interviewing people that they know, like family members or friends. And so how do we conduct these interviews with someone that we're so very, very familiar with, so that we don't have too many like inside jokes, or we want that sense of like familiarity and being comfortable with each other, but we don't want it so comfortable that no one else knows what's going on, or it's too much of a conversation. Like me as the interviewer, maybe I'm overtaking it because, I'm like, just shooting it with, my friend over here. So how do we keep like a somewhat of a professional distance with, if we're interviewing like our grandmother or our, neighbor? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I've had to interview a very, very good friend once, and that's definitely something that came up. I would say rely on that preparation beforehand, just because the person that you may be talking to is someone you know. Still do a little bit of research. Make sure you have things in order that you want to talk about. That set of questions can be helpful in that way. And then keeping in mind what the purpose of this conversation is. I think it's a really amazing opportunity to be able to conduct an oral history with someone you know very well. I don't get to do that super often, so it's really special when I do. And then once again, just approach that conversation, I would say, the way you do any other oral history. Make sure you're still transparent with them about the process. And then, uh, let that comfortability be a strength to the oral history, because then hopefully they'll be more comfortable telling you more. And then kind of stick to it the way you would any other interview. But that's definitely a tricky thing. That might take a little bit of practice, because it's already kind of can be a bit of an awkward interaction the first time or two you do it. So don't worry too much. Let that familiarity be a strength, if anything.
And something else to think about might be realize that you don't know everything about the person that you're interviewing. So even if it is your grandmother or a best friend or something, I've heard of people conducting oral interviews and learning things that they've never known before about a family member, because it's a completely different setting, or you've never asked, or things that intimate don't come up over family dinner or Thanksgiving. Things stay very light sometimes in family conversations.
Yeah.
So also just don't assume that I'm writing, I'm collecting this oral interview or this oral history and I already know everything about this person. Something that you never knew might come up, so be open to that as well.
Totally.
And can you give us a couple examples as people are prepping to conduct these oral histories? And specifically for this project, it's resilience through hardship. But for maybe this project or any other project that they're working on, can you give us some examples of questions that you've asked for oral histories, or what might make good questions that are not leading questions, that are open-ended questions?
Sure. Well, the first thing I would say is be brave with asking questions, of course, within reason. Um, that is something I think that I, particularly when I first started out, I was, still pretty young and just a student. So that was really intimidating, asking questions that now I would want to know. So some examples of questions I like to ask. I definitely like to ask a bit about where they grew up, what was their family like. If they oral histories, I would say, aren't just about getting the facts and figures of this person's life. It's also getting their interpretation, their thoughts, their feelings, their opinions on things. So yeah, once again, I worked predominantly on the LGBTQ history project. So we would often ask, what was your coming out experience like? And, keep it really open-ended. Or we would ask them specifically, how do you identify? And instead of assuming based on, however open they are. So really starting at the base level with that. I would say also, trying to think of some specific examples I would use in this particular project. I think asking folks about their experience living in this area, if they've left or traveled outside, what has that been like? You could also ask them if there are any, one of the ones I like to ask is, are there any national or regional events that happened in their life that made a big impact on them? So not being afraid to follow up with questions, I think is a great way of going about it. And then just kind of practice. Y'all are doing a practice session at the end of this today. If you're able to attend that, I highly encourage that you do. You're going to feel so much better just even getting a little bit of practice.
And we've got a couple other questions. Can you talk a little bit more about handling strong emotions from your interviewee?
Totally. That's a tricky one. I've definitely had to handle strong emotions in terms of getting a little overwhelmed or sad, or kind of the crying aspect. I've not had to handle them in the direction of getting worked up or upset or angry, fortunately. I think that don't be afraid of those. That absolutely can happen. particularly, once again, not all folks have been asked to talk about their life in this way, and it can be a little overwhelming, or, emotions can surprise you and pop up depending on what story they're telling if they're not used to telling it. I would say don't be afraid of it, and don't be afraid to, well, on one hand, I do encourage you to be, this is their story. You are supposed to be that blank canvas. Don't be afraid to be human. They're talking to a human, and that's what's amazing about oral histories, is you have a bit of that human connection. And give them the space to have those strong emotions. And it's totally okay to, if they're getting overwhelmed, to offer them to pause and step away if it's just getting too much. And I will also say, if at any point, hopefully this goes without saying, if at any point you feel like you let yourself be a little uncomfortable, but if you feel at any point that you aren't safe, or you're not prioritizing your well-being there, don't be afraid to step away and say, and you can use a wrap-up question if you want. Maybe mention it to the Historical Society. Perhaps they can follow up with that person if they want to. So don't be, I guess, wrap up, don't be afraid of emotions. It's always okay to, let those happen, to step away if they need to or you need to.
Okay. And let's wrap up with like one last question here. What if the interviewee starts asking personal questions of the interviewer? What do you do in that situation?
I've been in that situation. And I know folks who have been in that. I've been in that situation in a comfortable way. I know folks who have been in that situation in a less comfortable way. I think that's totally fine, depending on your comfort level. Once again, this, is research, but it is also a conversation. And I think some really awesome things can come out of those conversations sometimes. Sometimes it can spark the interviewee to remember something, or to talk about their experience in a unique way. Most of the questions I've been asked have been mostly about my involvement in whatever project I'm working on. And I have no problem talking about that. I guess just, figure out where your boundaries are, where you're comfortable with. It's okay to share a bit about yourself. But yeah, I mean, the times where I've talked to folks where boundaries have been crossed, what they have done is essentially just moved on to the next question. So if you got someone who's a little pesky, that's okay too.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. This was a wonderful workshop. Thank you so much for joining us. And we will send out, Sarah, you don't mind if we send out your contact information?
Yeah, that's totally fine.
For questions for Sarah. She's done a lot of oral interviews, so she's a great resource. But thank you so much for all of your insight. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and put my email in the chat as well.
Okay,
feel free to follow up if
so
y'all have any other questions.
We appreciate that. And so we're gonna take a few minute break, and so you can go get your snacks. I know I say snacks a lot, but that's because I love snacks. So get your snacks, check on whatever you need to check on, and we will start back with the second class in a moment. That will be about technology use, so very important. So we will see you in just a couple minutes.